Camilla, let's start with you. You are chief executive of Electrify Britain.
Yeah, it's a great name.
Yes, so you're a big oil and gas fan, are you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Exactly. No. So we've heard already in passing, I think Jason made reference to the 20% figure that is globally, if we look at the energy system, something like 20% of the final fuel, the stuff that we actually use, rather than what's dug out of the ground, primary fuel, that is final fuel is electricity. And every forecast that looks at the future sees that share growing. We heard from the UK government representative earlier today that Britain wants to lead the world, be an electro state. That number should, the electricity system should double in future. And you're a fan of this. You think this is a good idea. Can you tell us why you are championing electrification in the UK? What is the benefit, in particular from the point of view of the punter? And what benefits will they see?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in this country, we've built a lot of clean power and we're building a lot more. But fundamentally, if we don't pass on the benefits of that clean power to people and to businesses and to industry, then what have we got to show from it? In this room, we don't know if the electrons coming to us are clean or dirty. It doesn't affect our kind of service experience. So what we need to do is to be using those better technologies, if that's an electric car, or if it's an electric heating system, or perhaps it's powering your own home with your own electricity via solar, to really maintain and retain that social permission for what we're trying to achieve. This is the better future. This is the modern future that people want to be part of.
And how do you persuade people? One of my great heroes is the energy guru Imre Lovins, who created the Rocky Mountain Institute, a think tank. And he taught me a long time ago, he's a great clean energy advocate, efficiency advocate, but he argued that ordinary people don't care about energy. The electrons are things that magically appear out of the walls. What people care about is cold beer and hot showers. And so how do we persuade people, again, ultimately voters, consumers, without support from them, no transition is possible. You're stalled in the water. How do you show benefits when you're dealing with a product that is invisible and ultimately maybe fungible? One doesn't really know the dirtiness or cleanliness of the electron coming out of the wall.
Absolutely. So I have the great privilege of splitting my time between Westminster, the Senedd, Holyrood, and also going around Britain. When I'm in those, seats of power, there's a lot of gloominess, perhaps, and a little frustration about we're moving too slowly, whatever's going on. I get my kind of pep in my step from going around Britain because I talk to people, if that is a woman who has her grandson coming over regularly and it makes her stressed because he loves to play video games and she's worried about her electricity bills, then she gets a solar panel and she doesn't worry anymore. I also talk to businesses where their employees are benefiting from the fact that it's quieter, they've been able to modernize the factory, which means that the jobs are more secure. So the experiential experience of electrification is incredibly positive. 97% of people who buy an electric vehicle don't go back because they're just better cars. So we have to keep feeding that understanding of it being better. But, a lot of this is word of mouth. A lot of this is in the experience. And lastly, the other thing that we have to do is we really have to work incredibly hard to bring down the cost of electricity as much as possible. At the moment, gas is the one that sets the costs. And in reality, electricity is artificially inflated by putting those additional policy costs onto the bills. So that's something we really have to focus on to be able to really make electrification as attractive as possible.
Right. Well, thank you. Duncan, let's come to you. You're an investor. You had the opportunity to get to know your company and some of your investments over the years.
Yeah.
Around the world, in fact. And you often invest in what's called deep tech. That is stuff that takes a while. It's not two guys in a garage with an app. This is stuff that's stuff you can drop on your foot and things that takes 10 years or more to come to market. So you've been banging your head against the wall for a while. So you're the right man to talk to about the challenges of electrification. Can you tell us when we look at this transformation, what are a couple of the key enablers that you've figured out that are necessary, where we need to invest more and think for the longer term to make this electrification transformation more successful?
Yeah, so to be clear, I'm the odd one out on this panel because I'm kind of looking at the future, whereas everyone else is in the present. My job is really to be wrong about the future.
I'm backward looking, actually. Yeah. I'm very old-fashioned. Yeah.
Yeah, my job is to be wrong about the future most of the time and then right sometimes, but I need to be entertaining in the way that I'm wrong.
There you go.
So
entertaining, you're on.
Yes. So look, I've been investing in decarbonizing manufacturing, in reshoring manufacturing, in HVAC. I was originally, back in the day, I was an HVAC design engineer, and in data center decarbonization and efficiencies for a long time. And
something you've designed sits in the MoMA in New York. Is that right?
Yeah, it does. Yes.
Is it one of your HVAC units? Because I'd love to go and visit that.
No, it's an oven glove. Anyway, that's a completely different.
Okay, we'll discuss that over drinks later on. But carry on.
But it started for us in 2016. I think when I made my first long-duration energy storage bet, and that's a bet that I seem to make once every 4 years, thinking now is the time it's going to happen, and it doesn't until recently. If you look at
tell us what long means to you.
So long-duration energy storage is typically that's over 8 hours, up to 12, and then you've got others which go up to like ultra-long energy, which is up to 100 hours.
So current lithium-ion technology doesn't cut it for you. That's not long enough.
Well, it doesn't serve the needs of some of the more emerging data center requirements, which need much more demand shift than what you can provide with a traditional lithium ion. I mean, you can do it, it's just very expensive. So we're looking for ways to cut the cost of those. And these are grid needs as well. And we've assumed back in the day that, hey, look, the utilities are going to come on, they're going to purchase this stuff because it's very much needed. They didn't. It's a problem of, I think, just pricing some of this stuff with the ratepayers. And so what you've got now is a very interesting dynamic where all of those bets that we made are starting to work, not because the public grid is looking to engage with them, but it's actually the private grid, it's the data centers that are starting to invest a huge amount of money into these areas. So that's some of the areas that we're starting to see work really well. And that's everything from, done 13 different novel battery chemistries or modalities for storing energy. Supercapacitors for data centers, a range of other applications in the decarbonization of manufacturing, which is also a huge demand growth on the grid. If you think about data centers have sort of had the unfortunate kind of scapegoat, villainous kind of title in the press, but really a lot of this is being driven, as was mentioned earlier, by HVAC, people moving to heat pumps away from natural gas, and then us reshoring manufacturing into the UK or the US, where I'm based, and using electrified processes to get rid of very toxic and very pollutive other means to produce things.
So the durations that might be needed. I've heard it argued that we shouldn't just think about the very short term, which allows a little bit of peak shaving, let's say, where the market's already monetizes in places like Texas or in the UK. There are some rewards for time shifting, but we might need to think about much longer with the Dunkelflaute in Germany, when both the wind and the sun are not available for periods of time, or extended droughts in Brazil. So there may be periods of time for which one needs much longer duration.
Exactly.
Do we go beyond battery chemistries at that point to think about compressed fluids, or there's some new kinds of iron air type things that people are advocating? Do you have a vision for much longer, multi-week? Is this where Michael Labrecht's bugbear hydrogen comes into play as a multi-seasonal, multi-year storage, as I've heard some people argue?
For sure.
He might rush the stage if he's still here, by the way.
But the problem really is the pricing that we associate to it, not the actual technologies. The technologies are all there and they're available. It's really us figuring out how we charge appropriately for them based on the value that the energy is creating. So it's about creating incentives for those storage technologies, not whether they're able to come to market or not. I'll give you a great example. Like data centers right now create a huge amount of value from a kilowatt hour with a H100 cluster, which you just don't see the same value when that same kilowatt hour is going to heat someone's home. And so you have to kind of shift the amount of value to those new technologies to be able to encourage them. That's what we need to make this happen.
So, Andreas, I'm going to come to you because we've heard Duncan say in passing that data centers might well be some kind of ogre of the age. And since you're in the business of developing power solutions to unlock capacity for the data center portfolio, can you tell us why should we think of data centers in particular, those that power the hyperscale versions for AI, as part of the solution rather than part of the problem?
Yeah, I think data centers are part of the solution, and I'm here today to show up, and listen to what the concerns are on the regulator side, cross-industry side. Data centers drive cross-sector transformation. We are, as a sector, one of the biggest buyers of renewable energy, of course, and we enable a lot of new infrastructure. I think people are deeply passionate about infrastructure. There's a lot of passion in infrastructure always, no matter what type of infrastructure it is. And I can tell you from a personal perspective, I grew up next to an oil-fired power station in southwest Berlin, and this was in the 80s. And we've come such a long way from oil-fired power stations, then coal-fired power stations, which still make up 20% in Germany, to really transforming industry across sectors with digital infrastructure, that I think we can be part of the solution. And what's very important in that is that we explore all potential opportunities for co-siting infrastructure. There's a good example of us doing that in the US. We're co-siting with the power infrastructure of a battery energy storage system in Fort Worth, and that gets us a grid connection quicker. It is a great synergy, I believe. It's something we're trying to replicate in Europe. What we are seeing, however, I will mention, is caution on the investor community side that we also want to work with very closely, because I was at an investor event last week, and one comment I heard was, I like boring infrastructure. Well, one thing I can tell you is we are 100% moving away from boring infrastructure to very exciting infrastructure, I believe. But that will also mean that the investor proposition becomes more complex, just like the infrastructure. We have multiple projects hybridized as one. The 4 German TSOs are now switching from first come, first served to first ready, first served. And 25% of the score is achieved via hybridization. If you co-locate load generation and storage, that's 3 points for you.
Well, it's interesting, the argument about co-location. On Wednesday of this week, we're going to see President Trump with the leading figures from the big tech industry signing up for a quote-unquote voluntary pledge that he announced in the State of the Union a few days ago, in effect telling them that they need to bring their own generation, as well as to pay for their cost of the power and associated grid costs. And I'm curious to know what you think about this, and anyone else who wants to chime in on this, and we'll come to the both of you as well on your topics, but since it's on point for you, is this a good idea? Or does it have unintended consequences that you can foresee?
Grid constraints are a great opportunity to innovate. I like to say, power pressure makes diamonds. And I think that's the situation we're in at the moment. We are talking about innovation, and that innovation can happen on the grid. We should absolutely explore concepts like flexibility. We, CyrusOne, as a data center operator with over 1 gigawatt IT in operation worldwide, we have customers that we need to work very closely with, and we have service level agreements that we need to honor. So we have constraints where we can explore flexibility, but we would like to explore it as a concept because I believe it can unlock more capacity for everyone on the grid. And it doesn't have to be as drastic as reducing the import capacity from the maximum import capacity to a low value. We could also be talking about a temporary switch from firm to non-firm capacity. And I think there is so much system potential here. We'll be very closely need to understand how system operators define a system constraint even. On the off-grid side, I think there are opportunities there. However, we need to look at each and every one of them with caution. Because some of them come with implications for the carbon accounting, and we want to work very closely with customers to understand what they need. Of course, also local communities to understand what they need, because if we introduce gas-fired local generation, it comes with implications that we may be able to offset with market-based mechanisms. However, on a case-by-case basis, and this is particularly the case in Europe, where local generation is, in all honesty, much less of a topic still than in the US, we need to explore it on a case-by-case basis and work very closely with customers.
Yeah, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I mean, this is, to me, the really interesting thing that's happening in the market. You're seeing like private capital going into powering kind of behind-the-meter, really clean, firm power. That stuff should be on the grid, but it's not. As a citizen, that kind of worries me. As an investor, that's incredibly exciting. It just feels like we're making a decision at the moment to allow a bifurcation of the energy grids, to allow like a private one just for AI, and then us humans have to deal with the kind of the frail grid of the past. which doesn't seem fair to me.
Well, I mean, you're invoking, the Washington Post, for all its recent troubles, has run a series on the shadow grid, which is now being set up by these terrible, sinister AI hyperscaling types, and invoking the environmental catastrophe as well as lack of governance and various other things one can imagine from a shadow grid. It wasn't that long ago that going off grid and having, very adorable renewables, and it was more for crunchy granola types. It was not the shadow grid. It was the thing that people who are ecologically responsible did. But because it's the AI hyperscalers, it's now a shadow grid apparently. Yeah. So there goes the branding.
The scapegoats again. Yeah.
Exactly. But the more serious point you're making is do we want a parallel system? If this is where a lot of the capital is going, the grid needs lots of capital. We heard from a gentleman from Hitachi earlier about the backlogs that they have in infrastructure, and particularly in the US and Europe, which have had, for the last 20 years, very little load growth. On the contrary, we've had efficiency gains in Europe, particularly, reducing demand for energy. And in the US, it's been flat. Now, suddenly, we're beginning to see a bit of an uptick in which the tail of the dog is wagging the dog, which is AI, which is growing share of data centers, and data centers themselves in particular nodes where there's a lot of congestion, like Virginia that I mentioned earlier, where I was a few days ago, are creating particular localized problems. But broadly speaking, it must be said, there's an authoritative report released by one of the American national laboratories, which is Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory a few months ago, that showed very clearly the price increases that we've seen in the past were not driven by data centers. Right. It was making up for a legacy of underinvestment in the grid infrastructure, where we have catch-up spending, CapEx by the utilities, as well as supply chain inflation, which was again alluded to in an earlier session. And to some degree now, one could look at current policies where we see the least expensive way to make new electricity in America, which is solar, is being penalized by public policy, and onshore wind to a lesser degree. And so you're seeing policy and legacy as factors. And the question is, going forward, how to prevent AI and hyperscale demand from being a contributor to Granny having to pay more, right? And that's where I think we're seeing the bifurcation in terms of bring your own generation. Let's make sure you're not part of the problem as a political solution, which might have unintended consequences. I want to turn to Rachel, because Rachel, there's another big kahuna. Until the AI guys turned around, it used to be Walmart. You were the big kahuna, and also you've had your share, not you personally, but your company, of a protest and people saying, you're, the giant that moves into town. But nowadays, you're competing perhaps for grid access and power. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the perspective as a legacy giant that's omnipresent in America, certainly, and some other places as well? How do you see the question of electrification of your own operations and access to grid power?
Yeah, I'd say it's, 5 or 10 years ago, we probably could have assumed the electrons would be there, and now we simply cannot. So for folks in the audience, hello, I know Walmart's probably an odd entity to be seeing up on a panel talking about energy, but we're very involved and very invested in our locations throughout the U.S. I specifically lead our supply chain portfolio, which is one of the major drivers from an electrification perspective of where we have sites that are going from 1 to 2 megawatts. We've been the only employer in a small town somewhere. And we're putting in almost $1 billion of investment in automation to get goods and services just moving out of our distribution centers, DCs. That's what DC means to me.
I've been to your Bentonville operations. It's incredible.
It's incredible to
really
see.
Incredible to see
Well,
your headquarters.
So we're bringing those robots in, right? But the robots need HVAC. We have sites that haven't had at least centralized HVAC, so that's 2 or 3 megawatts of added load. The robots themselves, 2 to 3 megawatts. We've also got a number of electrification initiatives within our yard trucks. We've got electric standby, so our cold trucks can go plug in instead of running diesel constantly when they're loading or reloading at a site. So all in all, we have sites that we're making these investments in where they're going from 1 to 2 megawatts up to now we're talking 8, 9, 10 at some of our largest, which are anything refrigerated is going to consume the most amount of energy, even up to 20 megawatts. 5 years ago, we could reasonably assume that power would be there, and today we cannot. So a big part of our work has been, all right, let's make sure for any site we're retrofitting, let's go talk to the utility, see what we can work out. Greenfield sites for us, especially too, access is now a check we have to do to make sure that there's enough capacity on the grid for us to be able to construct and operate in the timeline that we want? And that answer is not always yes. So a big part of the solutioning on the team I lead is, okay, when that is the case, what are we putting behind the meter to be able to make sure that we can have the energy we want when we want it, at the sites where we want it, where, yesterday we probably wouldn't
Is
have
it
had
typically
this.
gas first, or what are you talking about behind the meter?
No, we'll do a mix. Depends on the site, depends on what's available. Walmart in general has done every type of kind of behind the meter, solar, storage, fuel cells, generators, of course. 1 or 2 sites, we've got some legacy wind. But that's harder for us to get into, obviously.
What's the lesson learned? Because again, you have such a footprint all over, and you've experimented for a number of years with different kinds of energy. Have you found a couple of leading contenders that make sense for you in areas where the grid may not be reliable?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to tease our facilities folks. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right. So it's been gensets for, I didn't make it up. I'm quoting somebody more important. But it's been generators for a long time, and so now we're finally seeing the business case for batteries come to fruition. We mapped out all of our outages across stores and supply chain sites last year. An hour is kind of the watershed mark where most sites are going to experience some type of outage at some sort of frequency for an hour or under, and the ones that exceed that hour tend to exceed it dramatically. So we've been able to make the business case because we've also worked on what the value of that uptime is for us at a store and at a supply chain site to say, hey, okay, if I know I have these types of outages at this part of the grid specifically, at this location specifically, and I know it costs me $5 an hour to be out. The number's not 5, but it's a little bit proprietary, so we'll use 5 in this instance. Here's what an investment in resilience and some type of energy on site is going to bring to the table for us. And we're seeing that be very impactful in moving the needle in terms of just being able to get energy assets up and keep our sites up and running as a major user.
So you're not making the case on carbon or sustainability grounds. This is a hard-nosed business case.
We've been very focused on the resilience side of the fence for the last year, I would say, because we cannot assume energy where we want it, when we want it anymore.
Right.
However, our portfolio really started focusing on the intersection between where can we save money and green. We still have a 2030 goal of getting 1 gigawatt of renewable energy on site, both among our supply chain and stores by 2030, and we're on our path there. I think we'll pretty comfortably hit it. We might have to play with placed in service and what that means in terms of the absolute timing, but we're on that path still. So I think as we worry about our kind of portfolio, ACRE is the acronym we use. Access, cost, resilience, and emissions are the 4 poles that we're looking at to make sure every site's got the advantage of the lowest cost energy and the timing that we want it.
Great. Richard, I want to come to you. I'm going to ask my audience, please submit a few questions on Slido. I look forward to seeing your questions in a moment. Richard, we heard what I thought were, terribly dismissive comments about wind from our speaker to your right. I think you may have slightly different views on the role that wind can play. Can you tell us,
I'm not anti-wind.
No, of course not. Exactly.
One of our stores to fit a whole turbine on it.
Exactly. No.
Just so
I'm just teasing.
Okay,
but obviously here at Fly the Flag for Ørsted, I'm sure you'll have something to say about wind and the role it can play. But if you can connect it literally to the point of connection, that is the grid, which we're here to talk about, what do we need to make the system, the grid system, more flexible, more capable of taking in wind and other kinds of intermittent renewables in a way that can really open up this opportunity of the energy transition, which we're here to talk about. What's your perspective?
Good morning, everyone. Yes, very happy to talk about that. So I come at this from the perspective of a large offshore wind developer. So we're talking about huge amounts of green electrons, coming offshore, onshore. So it's slightly different sort of perspective from some of the comments that we've had so far. But what I think is really interesting and is important is a lot of the conferences I go to, we just look at it from one perspective, when it is actually really, really useful to look at it from the whole system perspective. And really what we're all trying to achieve is that sort of secure, affordable, and that's obviously a key theme that keeps coming through, and resilient grid. So I think in terms of offshore wind, yes, we need to make sure that we are putting those huge volumes of green electrons electrons, onto the system to keep sort of meeting that energy demand. I think in terms of where we can help to sort of make sure that the grid is built out efficiently as possible and where it is stabilized as efficiently as possible. Actually, interestingly, Chris Stark talking earlier today, it's very, very good to see that we are now moving to a phase where there is much greater sort of coordination in terms of how the system is planned. So we are seeing, things which I think will sort of be useful and hopefully build out, a grid that will be fit for purpose. So things like strategic planning, we've heard about, queue reform and making sure that the projects that are ready are coming onto the system as quickly as possible. But the other thing, and it's touched upon a little bit earlier, is things around co-location. I think sort of, strategic planning is very, very important, but we still also need to give the market the space to actually deliver, some of the services which are, needed as a result of the amount of renewables that are coming onto the system. So I think it is important that we don't lose sight of, things like storage, sort of grid stability. I've heard others earlier today talking about sort of those, the voltage control, etc. So I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic where we are looking to be more and more coordinated because there will be efficiencies as a result of that, but at the same time giving innovation. So whilst offshore wind, primarily is there to put more green electrons, onto the system, we definitely do have a role to play in terms of helping to balance it as well.
And there's some innovation happening here too, right? Both in terms of technologies, but also business models and scale. I think many of us will know a few weeks ago there was a major announcement of North Sea wind development, offshore wind development, multiple countries involved, and among other things, there are arrangements for the output to go to multiple countries through long-distance cables that creates new opportunities for companies, but also perhaps creates some new risks. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see this opportunity of seeing Europe as a bigger market for offshore wind, not simply the nearest country, the opportunity for arbitrage? What does this mean in terms of the systems that need to rely on that resource? Are there technical challenges with having this bolder vision that Europe has put forward? And again, it was explicitly in the wake of some of President Trump's comments about Greenland at Davos and doubts raised by European officials about being overly reliant on American LNG and aspiring for a domestic kind of energy resource, which is how offshore wind is seen as a native resource, a European resource that's reliable. What technical challenges from the grid do you see to seeing that vision being realized?
I wouldn't describe it necessarily so much as the technical challenges. I think one of the things that needs to be looked at is really around sort of the models that are there in order to enable the investment that's required. I mean, fundamentally, I think everybody absolutely agrees that interconnection is a great thing. We have a fantastic sort of natural resource in wind in terms of say generating electrons and sort of say meeting that demand. And obviously a key part of that, whether that's sort of an onshore grid or across borders, is making sure that those electrons are flowing to where they're most needed. And obviously that helps also to kind of keep costs down if you are transferring them across borders. So I think that the technologies are there. I mean, we're seeing some really interesting things around energy islands between sort of Denmark and Germany. That's right. I think that's very much being looked at and progress is being made. So interconnectors already exist. We do see huge flows between the UK and the continent. I think one of the things that I work in the UK market, and there definitely is an increased focus on things like multi-purpose interconnectors. So it's not necessarily always the technical challenge in terms of, does the kit, exist and the technology behind it. The work that is now being done is making sure that those business models are there to make sure that, from our perspective, the offshore wind generators who connect into these, huge cables with power potentially going in that direction or power going in that direction, how do you provide that, like the route to market, the CFDs, the price stabilizations, etc. So from my perspective, it's not so much the technology, it's just making sure that the regulatory, and the
market design and the incentives that are in place,
the economics behind it are in place.
Presumably policy continuity as well. You don't want on again, off again policies with these sorts of very long-lived, very capital-intensive investments. We have a question from the floor, which I appreciate, which puts forward the idea of the corporate prosumer. I think it's directed at Walmart, but I wondered if anyone who wants to pick up on this idea of companies that not only consume energy but also produce. How big a deal is this? Again, we had talked about this perhaps becoming an AI data center hyperscaler, bring your own generation concept, but from the broader corporate world, if someone wants to jump in on this as an investment trend or a corporate trend?
Actually, I would speak to this. Walmart's got 6,000 locations across the US. We own primarily, we rent in some areas, but we own primarily. So it makes a ton of sense for us to be engaged in energy in this way. But the other big real estate, JLL, CBRE, they are Prologis, excuse me. They are all doing the exact same thing and saying, hey, these are sites that I have. I can guarantee you this energy. Maybe we'll put a project up to make sure that that's the case. And I think it's just the new reality of the grid that we're working with and the competition that we have that's kind of coming from the data centers to be able to meet load where we want it.
Yeah, from an investment perspective, this is super exciting, right? You've got completely uncost-conscious customers for the first time in energy who are prepared to invest into a variety of different energy storage needs, which is ultimately what's going to bring down the overall cost of energy for the consumer at their inception. Those types of technologies get much cheaper over time. It's kind of like technology that's spinning out of DoD. Like, it was so expensive to start with, but then there was a non-price conscious customer that was able to get it through the first couple of steps.
No, it doesn't mean that they're unthinking or uncritical. It's that they may have other priorities that come first, like security of supply or
exactly. It's much more
that
important.
Sort of thing,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
They're willing to pay more,
and the data centers
the value they get from that power is so much greater. In the case of AI companies, it's the NVIDIA chips that are so valuable. You have to get them to power, and the intelligence they create from it is worth so much. The cost of the power is relatively small, even if you double the price, presumably.
Exactly. Yeah, or triple or quadruple. And I think that's the interesting point here, that it's then spurring a load of investment opportunities for some of this nascent technology to finally get put into the world and then scale and ultimately become much cheaper, which is why I'm very bullish and thankful for the data centers, despite the initial burden that they're creating.
And just to say on the consumer, or as I remind people, consumers are also voters. So those same people side of things, very much that work to create public-private partnerships is where you get the biggest vote of confidence from people. You get two different narratives that run. At the national level, people want to see a conversation about security, but they don't trust entirely that the government or one company will do something. So that partnership is really, really powerful. And at the local level, people want to feel that this is happening with them, not to them, which is, an adage as old as time when it comes to infrastructure build. But we really have to pay attention to that. Otherwise, we will get pushback on the build out.
How would a public-private partnership work? Do you have a particular one in mind or a model?
So I think, for example, when we're talking about data centers, that experience of locating a data center, explaining that there is investment that isn't just being, put out onto your personal consumer bills, but that is trying to subsidize that. And that those who are building out that data center working with the local community to be able to bring local benefits as well. It will be that mix. But, to your point, this is about innovation and experimentation. We're doing this in a context of low trust, which is challenging. And we're doing it in a context of low trust because people are not experiencing yet electrification at scale. So we have to manage those tensions.
CyrusOne, as a data center operator, we do see it as a trend in the form of partnerships. So strong partnerships are needed between data center companies and power generation companies. We do have these partnerships in the US. We also have a strategic partnership in Europe with E.ON. So we are a data center operator. We will remain a data center operator, not a power station operator. We partner with competent partners who can do that for us. And I think these models will become more common. We have to think of digital infrastructure and energy as one system. And a particular challenge there is the timescales, the difference in timescales. Data centers are relatively short-term investment. Energy, as you know, is a long-term investment. When we complain as data centers about not getting power for 10 to 15 years, some of the energy industry may look at us thinking, what are you complaining about? 15 years is absolutely nothing. To us, 15 years is nothing. And in energy, the timescales are so long that they might not understand why we have a certain investment case that is based on a very short term. So we have to work together, find new models on the technical side, entirely doable. What we can offer on the local community side, just to briefly touch on that, we have great models for efficient use of natural gas, so combined cooling, heat and power, trigeneration, which can then also give heat export to the local communities. And I think that is something really tangible that people can see if the hot water in their home comes from the data center next door.
Great. I can see the red light is flashing on our clock here. So I think you'll agree that we've heard some quite nuanced and thoughtful responses to the question of can the grid keep up in the great electrification gamble. I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for their time. Thank you very much. Please.